Hi, Sam Spinat here for TheInformer. Today on Property Matters, I'm talking to principal lawyer Ron Cohen from Tisha Liner Fc Law, and we're going to be talking about some of the pitfalls of not doing your due diligence properly when purchasing a property, but also the difference between a conveyancer and a lawyer. Ron, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure, Sam. Great to be here and very happy to have a chat with you as always.
I appreciate your time, mate. I know it's very busy at this time of year, and look, I think it's a really important topic that not many people quite understand when dealing with conveyancers and lawyers and what the differences are, but also why is doing your due diligence so important?
Yeah, well, you know that, Sam. We've had that discussion many times. I always recommend to clients that they should get a contract of sale reviewed by a good property lawyer before they sign. Once you sign, you're locked into whatever the document says. And oftentimes when I do a due diligence, I might pick up things that can't then be rectified after the contract has been signed and the bargain has been made. Some of the issues that I have checked with due diligence is the registered proprietor on the title. Is that the same as the vendor? If not, why not? And how we can get that rectified before settlement. I'll always check the title itself. Are there any covenants or easements which restrict the property? A covenant might be a single dwelling covenant, for example, and an easement might be a drainage easement which allows a water authority access onto the land. Other issues might be whether it's a residential property or a commercial property. Usually with commercial, there's GST considerations, and we need to make a purchaser aware of those. And the other thing which is relevant are issues like leases. So if there's a commercial lease, we need to have a look at that and maybe even do a little bit of due diligence on the tenant and the terms of the lease as well. There are a few issues that I would normally check before a contract gets signed.
Of course. And what are some of the mistakes, I suppose we can call them, that you've seen people make over the years?
Yeah, that's again a good question, because people have been come to me without getting a legal due diligence with a contract signed. One example would be if you buy the property as a development site, and that's very important because obviously there's going to be a change of use and you want access to the land. So two examples that came across my desk. One of them was a developer buying the land subject to a commercial lease. And the lease had about a year or so to run. So the developer thought, that's great, we'll get a bit of income in while we're doing all of our planning process. The lease expires and then we'll start undertaking the development. What the developer didn't appreciate was that the tenant had another option to renew the lease for another 5 years. And they're stuck then in that scenario, having to negotiate with the tenant and pay out the tenant so that they can start the development in a timely manner. Another development site, there was an easement, a drainage easement, and the plans for the development were to build over that easement. So the developer then had to go through a planning process to get approval to remove the easement. And that again took time, 6 months, 12 months. So there were additional holding costs during that period as well.
And look, they're the kind of little mistakes that would have been picked up if they had have done their due diligence and would have saved them a lot of time and money. And
exactly, that's right. And the other one is cost. So one other example that I mentioned was if there's a commercial property, it's often plus GST. I had a situation where a client bought a commercial property, but it was for residential use, so non-business use, and the contract was priced plus GST. So all of a sudden, these purchasers ended up having to pay an extra 10% for the GST on top of the purchase price. And of course, they couldn't claim it back because it was non-business use. So they effectively lost the extra 10% that they had to pay in GST.
And that can make a good development turn bad very quickly.
Exactly, that's right. And the other one, again, due diligence wise, which you and I have gone through a few times when we've bought properties for clients, is when someone buys a unit as a part of a plan of subdivision, you've got to actually have a look there. They sell the property and there's a nice courtyard in front or a yard at the back, a backyard. On checking the plan of subdivision, those areas we've found have often been on common property. And if it's on common property, what that means is that any owner of any lot within the subdivision has got access to those areas. So we've had to, for example, negotiate with the owner's corporation for a license for exclusive use of that area. There's no certainty that the owner's corporation and other owners would agree to that. But even if they do, it takes time and cost. And again, it's something that might have been avoided had the contract been reviewed and we would have identified those issues before signing.
Fantastic. And look, there's some really good information and points there, Ron. I really appreciate that. And just briefly, while I've still got you, what is the difference between, say, a conveyancer and using a lawyer for your settlement process?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And don't get me wrong, there are actually plenty of really good conveyancers out there that I've dealt with. They've got a very good knowledge. But as you've said, a conveyancer really is just licensed to do the conveyancing, that is the transfer of the property from the vendor to the purchaser. Often it is the case that there are a lot of legal considerations that arise that a conveyancer is not properly qualified to deal with. And I've touched on a few of those previously. One of them is if there's a commercial lease on the property. So in a scenario like a commercial lease, I always do, I mentioned a due diligence on the lease, but there's also legal and legislation. If it's a retail lease, there's the Retail Leases Act that applies. In commercial leases, we're now in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's rent relief legislation under the Commercial Tenancy Relief Scheme. And a lot of the conveyancers may not necessarily know about the law or not qualified to actually advise their client. Whereas if it comes to us, we actually have got the legal knowledge of those areas, the leasing, not just in relation to the conveyancing. We also touched on development sites. So sometimes there are planning restrictions. There might be a covenant or there might be a planning agreement known as a Section 173 agreement. And again, there's laws and legislation under the Planning Act, etc., that we would need to advise a developer about before they actually, to determine whether or not the site's suitable. And a conveyancer, I know, wouldn't really be in a proper position to advise a client on those types of issues. We've had to give legal advice on a covenant as part of a developer's application to get a permit to develop land. Okay. And I think the final one, Sam, are things like disputes and defaults. What happens if there's a situation where things go wrong and there's a default by one party or there's a dispute? I've been involved in plenty of those types of transactions that may end up in litigation where a conveyancer wouldn't obviously be able to act, or where we try to negotiate a settlement and a variation of the contract, and we usually prepare a legal deed of variation and settlement, which again, there are legal ramifications to those. So it's definitely within the realms of a lawyer to prepare those types of documents. So there's a couple of examples of things that might happen.
Mate, thank you so much for that. That's given some real clarity just to some of the differences and why you should do things in a certain way. So I really do appreciate your time. And look, if anyone is thinking of buying or selling a property at the moment, always seek good legal advice and just go from there. Ron, thank you once again for your time today. This has been
Sam, my pleasure.
This has been another instalment of Property Matters for The Informer. Thank you.